The first bite never made it to my mouth. I was sitting in a private room at one of the nicest steakhouses in town, staring at the plate I had spent 3 weeks planning around, when my younger brother leaned in and said, "Try not to eat too much. You didn't pay for this." Before I could even process that, my aunt gave a little laugh and said, "Let the real family enjoy it." Nobody stopped them. My mother looked down. My father reached for his glass. Nobody said, "That's enough. She belongs here." So I set my fork down, picked up my coat, and walked out before the cake was even cut. What none of them knew was that the entire room, the whole dinner, every single drink, it was all sitting on my card. And when the manager walked back into that room an hour later, the night they thought they controlled turned into something none of them were ready for. If you were at that table, would you have smiled through it, or would you have walked out the way I did? Let me know in the comments. Now let's go back to where it all began, because this isn't a story about one dinner. It's a story about an entire lifetime. My name is Claire. I'm 35 years old. My family had one unspoken rule: keep the peace, no matter who pays the price for it. My mother, Elaine, always smoothed things over. My father, David, hated conflict so much he'd sit through almost anything in silence. And my younger brother, Mason, learned early that if he played the victim at the right moment, the whole house would rearrange itself around his feelings. I was always the responsible one, which really meant everyone assumed I needed nothing. I lived 25 minutes away with my husband, Evan. I worked hard. From the outside, my life looked solid. But to my family, that just meant one thing: Claire is fine. Claire doesn't need anything. Mason still lived close to our parents, still drifted from job to job, yet somehow remained the center of the family, simply because he was always around. My Aunt Linda, my father's older sister, recently divorced and endlessly bitter, treated every bit of my success like a personal insult. If I brought wine to dinner, I was showing off. If I missed a barbecue for work, I'd gotten too important. Nothing I did was ever right in her eyes. That's exactly why this party meant so much to me. It wasn't just about celebrating my parents. Somewhere deep down, I wanted proof that effort could still change the story. That one night, nobody would roll their eyes at me for trying. I spent 3 weeks planning everything in secret. I booked the private room through a friend at the restaurant. I planned the menu myself. My dad loves a good steak, and my mom always quietly orders salmon when no one's watching. I put together a playlist of the old songs that used to play around the house when I was a kid. I framed their wedding photos and lined them along the wall. I ordered a simple white frosted anniversary cake, the same kind my mother used to make for birthdays when money was tight. The only thing I didn't tell anyone was that I was the one paying for all of it: the room, the food, the bar, everything. I wanted it to feel like a gift, not a performance. By the evening of the party, I was tired, hungry, and a little emotional, but I kept telling myself it would all be worth it. I had no idea that before the first course was even finished, the very people I'd bent over backward for would remind me exactly where they thought I belonged. By 6:30 that evening, I was already at the restaurant. The room looked exactly the way I'd pictured it during all those sleepless nights. Warm lighting, crisp white linens, wedding photos lining the walls, the cake sitting under its glass cover. Tessa, the banquet manager and an old college friend, was walking me through the final details. She asked if I wanted my name on the welcome card. I said, "No, just happy anniversary, Mom and Dad. Keep it simple." Standing there, I remember thinking, maybe tonight would be the night I stopped bracing myself before every family gathering. Maybe tonight I could just be a daughter doing something loving and let that be enough. Mason and Linda arrived first. The moment they walked in, I felt that old familiar shift in the air. Mason looked around, hands in his pockets, and gave a low whistle. "Nice," he said, drawing it out just enough to sound like an accusation. Someone really wanted to make an impression. Linda barely looked at me before asking a server about the top-shelf whiskey. Then she looked me up and down and said, "All dressed up for a family dinner, huh?" I was wearing a simple dark green dress. With Linda, it never mattered. Jeans made me sloppy. Dressing up made me try hard. I smiled and said, "I just wanted tonight to feel special for Mom and Dad." Mason grabbed an appetizer before the rest of the family had even arrived. Linda ordered a second drink before finishing her first. 7 o'clock came and went. My parents still weren't there. I texted my mom. She said Dad had changed his shirt twice. and couldn't find the jacket she wanted him in. It almost made me laugh. By 7:40, Mason was picking at the charcuterie board like he was doing the restaurant a favor. Linda wandered the room inspecting the framed photos. Not fondly, but the way people look for something to criticize. She stopped at one and said, "Your mother was so thin back then. Life really comes at you fast." I looked away before she could see my face. At 7:45, the door finally opened. My parents walked in. Everyone shouted, "Surprise!" And for a few shining minutes, it truly was the evening I'd hoped for. My mother put both hands over her mouth and started crying before she'd even taken 3 steps in. My father froze, looked around at the photos, the flowers, the candlelight, then looked straight at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Not suspicion, not distraction, just raw emotion. He pulled me into a hug and whispered, "You did all this." I didn't say yes out loud, but I think he already knew. My mother kept touching the photo frames, laughing at old pictures. My father actually relaxed. Mason behaved for about 20 minutes. Even Linda stayed quiet once the food started coming out. That's what makes what happened next so much harder to swallow, because it's always worse when someone destroys a moment that had every chance of being beautiful. The first course came and went. Then the entrees arrived, one by one. My father got the ribeye, my mother, the salmon. Mason had ordered some expensive bourbon-glazed dish he never would have picked if he were paying for it himself. My plate was set down in front of me. I was so hungry my hands were nearly shaking. I hadn't eaten all day, too busy making sure every detail was perfect. I cut into the first bite and had just started lifting my fork when Mason leaned toward me with that lazy, smug half-grin he always wore right before saying something cruel enough to pass off as a joke. "Try not to eat too much, Claire," he said. "You didn't pay for this." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. Then Aunt Linda laughed, not loud, just sharp enough to cut through everything, and said, "Let the real family enjoy it for once. You can take home leftovers, if there are any." The room didn't go silent all at once. It collapsed into silence in pieces. My fork froze in the air. My mother looked down at her napkin. My father reached for his glass and said nothing. Nobody told Mason to stop. Nobody told Linda she'd crossed a line. Nobody said, "Claire paid for all of this." I set my fork down carefully, because my hand had started to tremble. I looked at Mason, then at Linda, then at my parents. "Did you really just say that to me?" I asked. Mason shrugged. "Relax, it was a joke." Linda leaned back in her chair. "Don't start. This is your parents' night." Finally, my mother looked up, touched my wrist for half a second, and said, "Honey, don't be so sensitive." That was it. Not Mason, not Linda. My mother. That was the exact moment something in me stopped asking to be understood. I stood up. No speech, no scene. I picked up my coat and put it on. My mother frowned. "Claire, where are you going? We haven't even cut the cake." I looked at her, then at my father, then at the beautifully arranged table where I suddenly felt like a stranger who had paid for the privilege of being insulted in public. "You should all enjoy the rest of the evening," I said quietly. "Really, please." Mason laughed under his breath. "There she goes, dramatic as usual." I didn't answer. I just walked out of that room, back straight, face calm, even though my chest felt like it had been split open. Walking down the hallway, past the music and the clinking glasses, one thought stayed with me. None of them know whose card paid for every single bite on that table. Not yet. Tessa spotted me in the hallway. One look at my face and her expression changed. "Claire, are you okay?" I nodded once. "I need you to do something for me." I kept my voice calm, because by then, calm felt stronger than anger. "In 1 hour," I said, "take the closing folio back into that room. Ask who's signing for the event. Room charge, catering, bar overages, gratuity, everything. If they look confused, tell them the event was booked and paid for by Claire." Tessa stared at me, then understood immediately. She didn't ask if I was sure. She'd heard enough in my voice. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm done for tonight." "Claire, I'm sorry. You worked so hard on this." I gave a small smile. "I know. That's kind of the point." She squeezed my arm. "I'll handle it." I thanked her and walked out into the warm night air. I sat in my car, both hands on the wheel, staring blankly through the windshield. My hands were shaking. My face was hot. My stomach was empty, which somehow made everything feel even crueler. I had paid for a dinner I never got to eat, decorated a room I'd been made to feel like a stranger in, built a celebration by hand, and walked out of it like I didn't belong. But underneath the hurt was something steadier, certainty. For once, I hadn't stayed long enough to let them crush me into pretending everything was fine. I left before they could rewrite what happened. At home, I stood quietly in the kitchen, still in my coat. I poured a glass of water. Then my phone lit up. A message from Tessa. I just left the room. Nobody could speak for a full minute. Your brother turned white. Your aunt asked me 3 times if I was serious. Your mom looked like she might cry. Your dad just kept saying, she paid for all of this. I read it twice. What I felt first wasn't triumph. It was relief. Relief that the truth had finally walked into that room, even though I wasn't there to see it. Relief that for once, nobody could talk over me or dismiss what had happened. The facts had done what I no longer had the words to do. I turned my phone face down before the calls could start. For that one quiet stretch of night, I wanted them to sit with it before I gave anyone the chance to explain themselves. Evan came home about 20 minutes later. One look at me, still standing in the kitchen in my coat, and he knew something was wrong. "Tell me," he said. So I did. I told him about the room, the dinner, Mason's comment, Linda's remark, and the part that hurt worse than both of them combined. My mother touching my wrist and telling me not to be so sensitive, while my father stared at his glass like silence was somehow neutral. Evan listened without interrupting, his anger rising with every sentence. When I finished, he said, "Let me get this straight. You spent weeks planning a beautiful anniversary dinner for your parents, paid for the whole thing yourself, got insulted at your own table, and nobody defended you?" "That about covers it," I said. My phone buzzed on the counter. "You're not answering that, right?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not tonight." "Good," he said, and ordered pizza, because the one thing I hadn't done all evening was actually eat. There was something almost absurd about sitting in my kitchen in a nice dress, eating pizza out of a cardboard box, after paying for a private steakhouse dinner I never got to touch. I started laughing, not because any of it was funny, but because sometimes laughing is the only alternative to crying, and I was too angry for tears. This story was never just about one dinner. It's about the people who get labeled strong or responsible by their families, and slowly lose their dignity because of it. Here's the truth. What you quietly tolerate becomes what people expect from you, and until you stand up for yourself, no one else will do it for you. If you've ever been at that table, the one where you had to walk away just to keep your dignity intact, let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because the next part is even more unbelievable.